So this particular article, I don't know, I couldn't find a date on the magazine that I could find that was easy to find. But this article, anyway, from 1979 by Arnold Hendrick. These are things that I've been grappling with as I've been trying to codify some hex crawl rules, basically to share, to do stuff with. And you tend to forget that people have been grappling with these questions in different ways for a long time. And it's easy to forget that, hey, wait a minute, people have been playing these games, doing this stuff for, especially if you include the wargaming element, for a very, very long time. And as usual, new generations come and are grappling with the same questions that older folks, the generations before, had already found ages ago. It seems to be the case with a lot of this. Populating medieval fantasy. Populating a medieval fantasy. Construction of a fantasy realm, either for traditional wargaming or fantasy games, requires some thought and figuring. Campaign game authors are all too prone to randomly placing towns, manors, and castles according to taste. And this is something as an aside, and I'm probably making a lot of asides here. On an aside, this has definitely been a frustration I've had, not just in terms of materials, but also just with generators as a whole, because and I've tried to avoid doing this with my personal thing because, one, I want to do something a little bit different, and two, I want to try to bring in something, quote unquote real, but something that makes a little bit of sense, right? When you're randomly generating hexes and you're just kind of getting towns, cities, villages kind of willy-nilly, depending on how you intend to use the space, it can come off weird if you dig into it, because what's this big city doing out in the middle of nowhere? What is this town doing, right? So I definitely feel what this person's going through. Of course, he's going through it in 1979, and we're in 2024. That the farmland shown is grossly insufficient for the population, or grossly in excess of the population's need, plus the profit it gains from the land, is something most ignore. Then there's the problem of farmland to non-agricultural land, which leads to the whole issue of population density, or more simply, how close together the towns, manors, and castles should be to reflect the historical period. The computations and figures given here will illustrate the calculations involved for medieval France in the 1200s, in terms familiar to chivalry and sorcery gamers, who are probably more inclined to create a complex and hopefully realistic fantasy world than any other type of gamer. Therefore, the data is designed to reflect high medieval France about 1200 AD. A short note is appropriate regarding medieval history with regard to France. Classic medieval period, roughly 1000 to 1400 AD, was not a period of decay, but one of regeneration. Europe had sunk to horrible depths in the Dark Ages, 500 to 1000 AD, in terms of population density, technical skills, mortality rate, natural and quote-unquote artificial, political structure, and just plain personal security. The medieval period was the time when national and international trade revived under increasingly large and more secure political units. Coinage appeared again, farming skills improved drastically, population grew until the plagues of the late 1300s, and the foundations were laid for national states as the kings of Western Europe very gradually increased their power at the expense of the nobility. While wargamers are inclined to lump anything between the fall of Rome and the use of gunpowder weapons as medieval, and therefore somewhat barbaric, historians have a very different view of the matter. If you walked into historical 1200 AD France, you would find yourself in a world full of optimism, where things were getting better and better, where people were pleased with their progress to date and expected more in the future. Crass personal ambition was still present, but became more subtle after 1100 AD due to the downfall of virtually all of the great quote-unquote nasties in the 1000s AD, such as the folks of Anjou and a variety of Norman adventures. Land, area, and population density. So they're using modern France, they're using medieval France as around the year 1200, which is kind of a nice, D&D and sort of medieval fantasy kind of varies, right? Or use the hodgepodge of, I think, similar to this, to the author suggesting that folks just kind of lump everything together. Medieval, I think that happens in D&D too, where we see stuff all over the map going, including gunpowder to a certain degree, depending, all the way down and mixed up with what we call it maybe, or what the author would call the more formally kind of dark ages eras of Europe. Land area and population density. Modern France has an area of 212,766 square miles and currently has over 45 million people. Remember, 1979. The estimated population of France in 1200 AD is 12 million people, or 56 persons per square mile. That is 11.4 acres per person, 640 acres to the square mile. So there's going to be a lot of the square mile and acre and kind of calculations, but I think once we see how it sort of lays out, we'll be able to, because I don't want to deal in square miles myself. I'm not trying to convert to square miles, or square kilometers or anything like that. I kind of enjoy hexes, and it's funny because there's something about hexes in here. But once you start getting the numbers, we can see how we might be able to take these numbers and kind of use that square mileage to kind of use hexes or adapt them to hexes of that we like, using the square mileage of our hexes as a guide for kind of how it fits with their square mile. However, it is wiser to deal with medieval population by households or family units. Demographically, a household assumes one breadwinning male plus the family he supports. Families with sons capable of a man's work balance against the aged and infirm, so that a typical peasant family with 3 generations under the same roof might actually be considered 2 or 3 households. For this period, the author prefers an arbitrary 5 persons per household, which fits perfectly into chivalry and sorcery, where 20% of the population can bear arms, do a man's work in war. Many demographers use 4 persons per household, but often for more recent periods, and in any event, they are rarely happy with the results and fill their findings with caveats. This yields a population density of 11 households per square mile, or 58.2 acres per household for France in 1200 AD. Diet in the Middle Ages was cereal-based, supplemented by vegetables, occasional fish, fowl, or meat. This is healthy, if less than perfect, as modern Asia continues to prove. As such, a person can be assumed to require about 500 pounds of food per year, or 2,500 pounds for a household. The yield of farmland is expressed as a ratio of hundreds of pounds per acre. Good land in France in 1200 AD might yield 5 to 1 or 500 pounds per acre per year. This is a great improvement over the Dark Ages, where the yield was 2 to 1 to 3 to 1. Naturally, the type of crop and especially the weather could influence yield. In bad years, the ratio might drop to 2.5 to 1 to 4 to 1, and in good years climb as high as 7 to 1 or 8 to 1. Local prices for foodstuffs is a good measure of their yield in relation to each other. The higher the yield, the lower the price. Supply and demand laws worked very well in the medieval world. Now, this is getting a lot of kind of minutia, which is not usually my jam, but it's gonna be worth it, I would say, when we finally get to kind of a table where he'll round all this off into some tables. That will be kind of interesting. However, it is extremely unwise to sow and reap the same field every year, as within 5 or 10 years the land will be exhausted, and even after the first, a significant loss in yield can be seen. In the Dark Ages, a 2-field system was used, whereby a field was sown every other year. Except in special situations, this is also deleterious to the land, and by the High Middle Ages, a 3-field system was used, where a field was only sown for harvest once every 3 years, sometimes with a very secondary and sparse crop used in one of the 2 off years. Therefore, a man required 3 acres of land for every acre actually producing food. All this calculations that he's doing and running us through is going to get us towards, he's going to crunch all the numbers in a couple minutes. But this stuff is also useful to think about, right? How much, just for painting the scenes when you're looking at farmland and agriculture, if you're in a kind of medieval sort of fantastic thing, kind of what one needs to survive and thrive. It is also worthwhile to mention that the land production figures assume good, rich, full land. The use of horses with shoulder collars pulling iron-bladed plows, and the horses themselves having iron shoes. In the Dark Ages, wooden plows were common, and oxes in simple harness, rather than shoulder harness, were the common beast, if not the farmer himself without animal aid. Finding good land wasn't too difficult, since until the 1300s, a great deal of European land was forested, and one need only clear the forest to get a good farm. In fact, the Middle Ages was mainly a period in which the expanding population did clear away the forest which had grown up, and returned much of Europe's available land to the plow. Returning to computations of averages, using a 3-field system with 5 to 1 yield, a household would need 15 acres to fulfill its needs. However, given the political structure, in return for security, virtually all farmers had to pay taxes to the political system in money or kind to their lords. In chivalry and sorcery, this is 90 copper pieces a month, give or take 5 copper pieces a month, which can be assumed to be the money value of the excess food produced. Since 1 copper piece equals 1 pound of cereals, and I guess this is from chivalry and sorcery, but it's kind of a neat idea that 1 copper is 1 pound of cereals, which I would definitely use. On the average 50 copper pieces a bushel, this means a household is producing about an extra 1,100 pounds a year for a total production of 3,600 pounds per year. This would require 21.6 acres per household of farmland. This leads to the conclusion that a square mile of farmland with 1/3 of it under production at any one time would have 29.6 households working it, or 148 people. This contrasts the overall average of 56 per square mile. Naturally, there must be unfarmed land. Mathematically, the figures require that 62% of the total land must be unfarmed, 38 farmed to produce the proper population density. This, in every 5 square miles, you would expect to find 2 being farmed and 3 being wooded and or rugged hills or mountains. Considering each man on a medieval manor equivalent to a household, reasonable by definition of the letter, The farmland and total area of various manorial holdings or lands around a town may be computed. Following land area tables are based on the chivalry and sorcery tables for size of manors and towns and their internal composition. So we see this table here where it's got the... now, I actually have chivalry and sorcery, but I didn't. I knew it took me a minute to remember what it looked like. And when I remember what it looked like, then I remembered that, oh, yes, I actually have this book. So we have interior region manors, frontier region manors, and some baronial holdings. The holdings also go on to the second page, which you can look at. So the smallest of the small, which would be an interior small manor. Now, I'm guessing, I don't know, but my guess would be that the interior ones can be smaller because they're in the interior. That you probably want your biggest, baddest fortresses at points of contention, which are most likely in an established kingdom or some kind of state at this time, is going to be on your frontiers. So you're going to want your beefiest things on your frontiers, and you might have smaller ones in the middle. Of course, that might change. There are reasons why, your borders change. So then something that was on the outskirts is now on the interior, and vice versa, right? There are reasons why a lot of this stuff might change a bit, but just as maybe a general rule, I'm guessing, because you can see the interior small is smaller in number of households than the frontier small, so that leads me to believe it. But what you get is a small manor, about 78 households, 2.5 square miles of farmland, and total land of about 7 square miles. That to me tracks not exactly, I would say, but pretty closely to my 3-mile hexes or something, right? Something of that nature. You get 7.794 in area, which is really close to the 7 square miles. And I remember reading some stuff where people had maybe done some of this work. Heck, maybe they'd even referenced this article. And I'd seen people saying, hey, a 3-mile hex is really good because it sort of squares with your smallest kind of manorial estate. And then I did some work that seemed to be leading me in that same direction, going, oh yeah, that seems to kind of work. And so here it's kind of confirmed again by someone who, and he doesn't list all his sources out, and I have no idea what his sources are, but you get a similar type of thing. That a small manor, notice in Swords and Wizardry, they have, four different varieties or 4 different sizes of quote unquote small manor. I'm not sure that for myself I need that much. Maybe I could just multiply, but I'm easy to take that and just say, okay, well, the next level is going to be about, just use that kind of smaller hex and maybe even go to 2 hexes or 3 hexes or kind of use that 3 number. It might not be as neat as this. It doesn't really have to be, I don't think, but I saw that number as I was flipping through it at CleriCon. I was like, oh my gosh, this is a really good fit. And it's just nice because what I've always been wondering about is that households number. So you can look at that households if you do that, and that's a nice number to have. You could round it up or down, however you like. Maybe you want to roll some dice to figure it out. You could do something, I don't know, 3d6 times whatever to get there and figure out what's really going on. But that's what intrigued me. I mean, the whole article's intriguing, but I thought, oh my gosh, that's really nice. And so what you have here is we have these things. We don't need to use all of these. Right? But we get these nice numbers with a little bit of backup. Most medieval towns, quote unquote towns, are really villages associated with a noble's manor. Of some 3,000 German towns examined in one study, 93% were under 1,000 in population, less than 200 households, and only 15 towns had a population greater than 10,000. Judging from examples in Britain, the normal quote unquote town, as distinguished from a manorial village, had 2,000 to 4,000 persons. And this is something that I've always been into, is kind of downgrading the size of what I anticipate for cities and towns, right? You get in D&D, and not just D&D, I'm not trying to point something out to them. Huge cities, water deep with millions of souls and all this stuff, and it's fine. It's fine, but I always be like, no, my cities are really kind of small. Towns small. I like to kind of shrink them down. So it's kind of nice to see that supported. From we were saying that, hey, most towns were pretty darn tiny. Most towns were really just villages with a noble's manor. And I always thought with the village kind of thing is that at some point, if you have your village that's near, and it just because of its situation or whatnot, it starts to develop a bigger presence. It develops that commercial identity, whereas a village is all about just supplying raw materials and foodstuffs. That's a village's purpose. A town's purpose is commercial and administration, trade, commerce, craft, that kind of thing. Maybe a military function, maybe a religious function. So once you have some village and a castle, and for whatever reason, be it location or someone just desires it or whatnot, it sort of grows organically, or that functions maybe thrust upon it, then it becomes a town, and it becomes much less about the raw materials and supplying than it about taking those things and converting it into some kind of service. The greatest medieval city in Western Europe is generally thought to be Paris, whose population was double London and quoted at 80,000 persons. However, most scholars feel this figure is best for the early 1300s when medieval population peaked. France's population in 1340 is estimated at 21 million, so that working backward and proportionally, if Paris was 80,000 in 1340, it would be about 34,000 in 1200 AD. London, the next largest outside the Mediterranean basin, would be 23,000 or so. Thus, with towns averaging 2,000 to 4,000 persons, it is not unreasonable to call a city, quote unquote, something with 10,000 or more, or certainly with 15,000. Medieval cities could only exist because they imported food. This is something else that I've talked about, right? I just mentioned it. Villages are for food, and cities and towns and whatnot are for basically consuming materials and turning it into something else. Medieval cities could only exist because they imported food. The major cities of northern Italy very often only had enough farmland outside their walls for half their needs. The rest was purchased from boundary. I guess that's from boundary. The city's political boundary, either from neighboring agricultural regions or sometimes shipped by land or sea at some distance. With this as a precedent, it is likely that a single town or castle was unable to provide direct control and security for more than 60 to 70 square miles of farmland, or a total territory of 150 to 200 square miles. This means that a square area 12 by 12 or 14 by 14 miles, or a circle of 14 to 16 miles in diameter. This is about the distance an army can comfortably march in a day. It would be nice to figure out those numbers, and I could probably sit there and calculate it out to about what that is. I don't know. However, what it is suggesting is one castle for some massive piece of land isn't going to cut it. You're going to need more. You could probably work out if a town can only support about half of itself with its food, then you could maybe even think about, well, how much does a village produce, and how many villages does it take for a town of so many people? And that's something I want to do. I messed around with this before on one of my streams where I was saying, okay, if you have 4 villages clustered together, maybe one of those villages could become a town, because then it can be supported by importing materials from the surrounding villages. And I'm probably going to try to come up with some decent round numbers to use just as something to go with. I'm not there yet, but this is it seems to be sort of suggesting a similar type system, though he hadn't gotten around, at least in this article, to figuring out what that would be. This data checks, since the entire concept of feudal military structure is that the local castle, fortified town, or city, or whatever, will provide all necessary military security for its lands on a direct and immediate basis. The size of territory given above, at the maximum, permits forces from a centrally located castle or town to reach any part of the territory the same day as summons for help arrives, assuming the troops march instantly, or the next day if the troops need time to prepare. And this is important because in the, from the 800s on to, the Viking Age, pretty much, I'm not sure what the end date is for the Viking Age, you had these people striking, and it could be from anywhere. At least, obviously it was coasts but then rivers, surprising places. But yeah, folks who are striking in there, and they're in like lightning, and they're out again. And you don't have time to signal back to Paris in the center of the country to then gather troops and ride all the way out to you, who was on the coast of the North Sea. They're never going to get there in time. Before they got there, it's all over. So you needed to essentially give practical control to people who were on the spot, who could get folks going. So this is, hey, we got this strong point. That strong point also means people can go flee there when something's happening. Oh, the Vikings are coming. Okay, we can run up to this castle. We can get inside. It's going to be relatively safe. And from there, that strong point, the forces of the state can ride out and respond in good time. And the thing is I'm talking about Vikings, but if you think about it in a medieval fantasy type situation, it's going to be the same thing if a dragon attacks or some other monster incursion. They're going to happen fast. One of these creatures can pop out of nowhere, and people need to respond to it. I think that's one of the reasons why the kind of medieval, the sort of European or feudal, because I know the feudal system, or close enough to it, existed outside of Europe, but that kind of feudal medieval system kind of works because it sort of makes sense, right? You might not have your fantasy Vikings, but you've got orcs and goblins and giants and dragons and all kinds of stuff just coming out of nowhere, blitzing across the countryside. And they need to be responded to quickly, because if you wait too long, yeah, the dragon's gone, they've moved on, everything's over. So that same kind of feudal network sort of works. Mapping and campaigning within a realm. I read this and this was like, ooh, it hit me close. But still. Although wargamers are most familiar with hex grid maps and movement systems, a little examination and experimentation with numbers can show the horrible problems involved. Not to mention the very unsatisfactory results hex grid campaign systems have often produced when miniature armies on the tabletop are used to resolve battles. Now, of course, I'm not running miniature tabletop battles, but still, it hurt me reading that. For example, the designers of Chivalry and Sorcery use hexes 10 miles across. This gives a hex 86.6 square miles, meaning that major towns, cities, and castles will control an area of 2 or perhaps 3 hexes each, and smaller manages and villages will be crammed together at 2 or 3 more per hex. In this scale, hexes as a measuring tool become meaningless. Now, to this point, this is why I like those 3-mile hexes, because then we can really say that, okay, 1 hex is 1 manor. The smallest thing you can have is 1 manor, so you don't have to get caught in that problem of 1 hex has an entire little duchy inside, or barony, or whatever, some big multiple things in it. So that's the reason why when I moved from, that was one of the reasons why I moved from 6 miles to 3 miles. I like this idea of having this base unit that I won't really feel the need to get smaller in, at least in terms of sort of political systems. That, hey, this hex, 3 miles, 1 settlement in there, and I'm good. Whereas once you move above that, you can get that issue of representing multiple things in hex. Now, given that we're not playing a war game, it may be fine to cram a lot of things in there, but even then, the way we sort of represent hexes abstractly, I like that I can put a town or sort of a marker in there and not have to have multiple things in there. Figure that it can just be just 1 marker for that. And anything else, then what I probably will want to do with this is say, okay, if that's my smallest unit, then if I'm getting a bigger manor or a bigger town, how many of these 3-mile hex units do I need to support that particular holding? Or how big does that area have to be, that kind of territory, that the boundary need to be to support that? Even at 4 or 5 miles across per hex, the problem is still significant, since there is precious little maneuver room between objects of importance. The root of the problem is that a hex represents the area around a castle, town, or manor, as well as the structure itself. That part, it doesn't really matter to me. I'm not wargaming, so it doesn't, those sort of hex, if there are multiple things that whose hexes touch, like, that's fine. But obviously, he's coming from a wargaming perspective where that might change. However, for those who are addicted to hexes, all right, mea culpa, the formula for computing the area of a hexagon is 3.464, I guess, times parentheses d divided by a squared, where d equals diameter of the hex, distance across flats. An alternate solution is to drop all artificial measuring systems, such as squares, hexes, or areas, and just use a fully scaled map, measuring and marking the location of troops day by day on the map itself. This has the advantage of permitting beautiful-looking campaigns and a realistic quote-unquote feel generally unavailable as you calculate out alternative lines of march using a pair of dividers. For small-scale medieval campaigning, a scale of 4 miles an inch is very useful. Maps can be composed on approximately, all right, I might skip this stuff. So here's going into how to measure it out if you want to do this on your war game. I will skip. Fascinating stuff here. In particular, I did like reading. It's kind of funny, the stuff you get into doing for this hobby. Granted, it's dry reading, but getting down to it with these table size or these manor sizes and their square model and stuff, I think it's going to be really handy. That I'm going to definitely lean on this a little bit, just to get some kind of round figures. So, for example, I might just have as types small manor, castle, town, city kind of thing, and not worry so much about all the. You can use dice to figure out some of the smaller pieces of it, how small and large it is, but really, really cool.